Well, hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Veg Grower Podcast. My name's Richard and I want to encourage and inspire you to grow more of your own food. Happy New Year to you. It seems a little bit weird to say Happy New Year when we are 6 days in, but this is the first episode of 2025. And I've got to admit, after the Christmas period where I did manage to get some time off work, had quite a relaxing time visiting friends and family as well, but in the downtime I've managed to do a little bit of gardening and I feel all the better for it. I feel positive. I know the weather hasn't been great, but I feel positive and I feel ready to tackle 2025 head on. Now you might be wondering, what have I been doing during the Christmas period? Well, in my greenhouse here at home, I actually have managed to sort out the beds and fill those up completely with gravel. And I've also set up my autopot system in there. Autopot we featured a lot last year and we're expanding on that as we go into 2025. So I've set up 3 of the Auto 2 grows in there. But for Christmas, my wife also got me the 4-pot system, which I haven't got set up just yet, but I'm looking forward to see how that performs in the future. Down on the allotment, I've been clearing away at the top of the allotment as well, covered that over in cardboard to reduce weeds. Looking forward to seeing how that performs throughout the year. And of course, we have been sowing a few seeds. Now, this brings me up into our segment or today's topic, because we are into January and many people are itching to sow lots of seeds. But I think it is best to only sow certain seeds. One of those seeds that we sowed over the Christmas period is, of course, exhibition onions. But there's another seed that I always sow in January, and I'm always excited to sow this one. What is that, I hear you ask? Well, come meet me in the greenhouse and we're going to find out. Now, I'm in my greenhouse because I'm sowing the seed of the month, and that is rhubarb. I absolutely love growing rhubarb from seed. I pretty much do it every January. It seems to be an ideal seed to start off in January when we're all itching to sow some seeds, but the light levels and the warmth levels just aren't quite there to really get seeds going. Rhubarb seeds are easily available. I get mine from Premier Seeds Direct, which, as you know, we do quite a bit of work with. They're a great place to get many of your seeds. There are, of course, links in the show notes if that's of any interest to you. But you might think that sowing rhubarb from seed is a little odd. Usually we'll go to a garden centre and buy a plant, a crown from a garden centre and plant that. And that is probably what many people have done in the past. That is still pretty easy. It's a good way of doing it. But for the last few years, every January, I will sow some rhubarb seeds. It is so incredibly easy to grow from seed. It's one of the easiest plants I've found to propagate from seed. Now what I do is I take a tray of my plug plant starters and I just fill that up with multi-purpose compost. Now I'm using multi-purpose compost, not seed compost, because rhubarb is quite a hungry plant, and once it starts growing it's going to need some of those nutrients. So we just fill that up with multi-purpose compost. I will have to admit that I do set this up the day before so that the compost warms up. I put mine in my indoors in the heated propagator to warm up overnight, and then I come out in the morning, I brought it out to the greenhouse, and all I'm doing is just pricking a hole in the centre of each plug plant about 1 centimetre deep, dropping a single seed into it and then covering over that seed. 1 seed per station is plenty. I do find that if it's fresh seed we get really good germination rates, so all these seeds will pretty much germinate. They're quite large seeds as well, which makes them really, really easy to handle. Because it is cold, I will place my rhubarb seeds inside a heated propagator. If you haven't got a heated propagator, don't worry, just over a radiator or anything that just keeps them a little bit warm. Over sort of 15 to 20 degrees C is ideal. Germination will take about 2 weeks, can be a little slow, but they will germinate. And once they germinate, you need to make sure, of course, they're still in a bit of warmth, kept indoors, but also plenty of light. Mine will be under grow lights because I'm lucky enough to have grow lights. But if you haven't got grow lights, then a well sunny windowsill will do just as well. But just make sure they get plenty of light and continue to grow. Now, as these plants will grow, eventually the roots will start coming out the bottom of these plug plants. And that's the point that we need to pop them up into larger plants. And I will repeat that as the plants grow, just gradually getting them into bigger and bigger pots. By about mid-March, I find that my greenhouse will be warm enough for these seedlings to go out in the greenhouse, which just frees up a bit of space indoors. And then by about mid-May, they can go outside. And again, it's just a case of keeping them potted up as we go. Now, we can grow rhubarb in the ground in a well-prepared beds, basically cleared over with plenty of weeds removed, plenty of organic matter, be it compost or well-rotted horse manure, added to the soil, and then we plant our rhubarb directly into that. But if you have a really, really large pot, you can also grow rhubarb in pots. And what I quite often see people do is grow them into the large plastic trugs. They seem to be very, very popular with rhubarb. They grow perfectly happy. My mum has actually grown one of my rhubarb seed plants in a grow bag, and that seems to be quite effective as well. Once they are planted, it's just a case of making sure the soil doesn't dry out and keep them well hydrated so that they establish. The establishment doesn't take too long, but once they are really growing, you are ready to go. Your rhubarb plants are ready to go. Now, there are some varieties that you can actually start harvesting in the first year, but most varieties, to be honest, I would wait until the second year before I start harvesting any rhubarb from them. To harvest, we just simply go along all the stalks and pull any stalks that come off easily. Got to remember not to pull every single stalk off, of course, because the plant will still need the leaves to photosynthesize and produce decent roots. Once we hit about September, October, I don't tend to harvest as much rhubarb, but I do start to prepare the bed by giving it a good mulch ready for the winter. The leaves will die down as we go on into winter, and I give it a good covering, ideally with compost. Compost is the best because that's going to feed the plant. Rhubarb is incredibly hungry. But I've also used wood chips, leaves, straw as well, just to protect the crown over the winter months. But to be honest, rhubarb is so hardy. As an example of how hardy and how tough rhubarb is, my stepdad, in a house that we used to live in, he would run over a rhubarb plant that was in the front garden with a lawnmower every time he mowed the lawn. That rhubarb still kept coming back. It was so hardy. And of course, rhubarb is great in crumbles. I have to admit, I didn't like rhubarb as a child, but it's grown on me as I became an adult, and I start loving rhubarb crumbles. We've thrown it into some pork dishes as well. We find rhubarb and pork goes really well together. And there's so many things that we can also do with rhubarb. There's forced rhubarb, where you place a bucket over the top of a crown, once it's established, of course, and you get some thin, pink but sweet tasting stems, which just add another dimension to the rhubarb. Basically, plenty more things that we can do with rhubarb to make it all the more interesting. But a big question you might still be asking is, why should we grow from seed? One of the reasons I think we should grow from seed is that there is more choice of different varieties. Now, I asked on social media today what people's favourite variety of rhubarb is, and Champagne and Victoria become the most common varieties, and these are what are often sold in garden centres. But there are many other varieties, and when you start looking into seeds, it opens up the eyes of what else is possible. Not only that, not just different varieties. Another reason I like to grow from seed is the price. So one rhubarb plant these days from a garden centre is about £5, but you can buy a pack of seeds from Premier Seeds for £1.19, and pretty much you will guarantee that every single seed will germinate. So you will get a lot more plants for less money. Now, what I tend to do, because I do sow these every year, what I tend to do with my excess plants is that I actually give them to my mum. My mum goes to a car boot every week and sells items for charity. So I actually donate some excess rhubarb plants to her to sell for the charity. And what we found is that rhubarb was incredibly popular and so easy to sell at these car boots. Pretty much as soon as they were put out, they were sold within one day. That for me is a good reason to continue growing rhubarb from seed. Give it a go. Let me know how you get on. It is our seed of the month. There will be links in the show notes if you are interested in that. Now, I'm going to head on out to the shed and just run through what other seeds we can sow this month. In the meantime, let's find out what's been going on in the Supporters Club this week. Well, I hope you are enjoying this podcast so far. If you are, then please rate and review on your podcast provider. It only takes you a few seconds, but it means the world to us and it helps us get found by more people who might also be interested in growing their own food. Not only that, if you want to help support this podcast and keep this podcast running, then please consider becoming a member of the Veg Grower Podcast Supporters Club. Being a member gives you access to extra behind-the-scenes podcasts, and each month that you are a member, you will receive in the post our monthly pack. In that pack, it contains our monthly newsletter, which gives you a few ideas of what you can do in the allotment or the kitchen garden throughout that month. But you also get a collection of seeds that can be sown in that very month as well. And all that is just £5 a month. I think it's an absolute bargain, but I would say that, of course. But many of my members always tell me they are very happy with it as well. Now, if that is something you would be interested in, then head to the veggrowerpodcast.co.uk to sign up and find out more. But as an example, we have actually started January seeds off, and we did sow some basil seeds that I included in the pack for January. Basil being a delicious herb that I think is well worth growing right throughout the year. So once again, head to the veggrowerpodcast.co.uk and please consider becoming a member of our supporters club. Right, let's get back to the gardening. Now, I said in the opening that January I often find that people are itching to sow some seeds. But the trouble is, when you look on the back of certain packets of seeds, they tell you they can be sown in January, but reality is they're not really that efficient. Something like tomatoes is a great example. Many seed packets will tell you you can sow tomatoes in January. The trouble with that is I find that the tomatoes tend to get a little bit too big before they can go anywhere else. And if you haven't got a heated propagator, they're going to be dying off by about end of February, middle March, because they don't have the room. So I have made a list of seeds that we could sow this month, especially towards the second half of the month. Now, first of all on my list is broad beans. Broad beans are a great plant that we often sow over winter months. It certainly makes a lot of difference and is a great one to really get plants started. These are the overwintering varieties such as Aqua Dolce Claudia, which we do sow back in November as well. We can sow these directly in the ground, but because it has been cold at the moment, I would actually say in a greenhouse or indoors just to get them started. Onions. We actually sowed some onions over the Christmas period. These are going to be our main crop onions that we're growing from seed. Some of the exhibition varieties are ideal to be sowing at this time. But what I do say is when it comes to onions, I think heated propagators or on a radiator is a must just to get them off to a good start. I do find that they do need a little bit of TLC in the younger years. But again, if you haven't got those on a radiator or you don't want to do that, you can wait till a little bit later on. Now, leeks is next on my list, and I would often start my leeks off towards the second half of January. I tend to grow mine in insulated boxes inside my greenhouse to get them started. They can be a little slow, but No problem with that. We do grow lots of different types of leeks, so it's always good to get those started. Chard is another one that we could grow this month, but again, it's going to need sowing indoors. The seeds are quite thick, so they can do quite well. We also have winter spinach, lettuce, some of our salady crops, which, as you know, I do eat a lot of salads, especially at the moment. I am on another health kick. So we're going to be growing lots of these. Winter spinach, winter lettuces are ideal. They'll be out in my veggie pod, so they will be growing outside, but they do have a bit of protection. Parsley, basil, coriander, a few of those sort of herbs we can also sow in pots on our kitchen windowsill, where again they should just get off to a good start. They will need a bit of protection. Again, they can't be outside, but they will get growing indoors. Radishes, carrots, we can also sow those with the right varieties and under protection, such as in my veggie pot. I was actually surprised last year. I sowed some carrots in December, not expecting them to germinate. These were a variety called Amsterdam Forcing 3. Did not expect them to germinate, but they did. And I was absolutely chuffed to pieces with that because I thought it was going to be too cold, and I was proven wrong. And it's the same with radishes as well. Celery is a good one to start off this month. Again, we will need to sow these indoors. They do need a bit of heat to get going. It will be a little bit too cold outdoors, but it could be a good one. Celery, I find, does need quite a long growing period, but it also needs a lot of water when it is growing. So definitely one to think about growing too. Chicory. Good old chicory. I know that's not everybody's favourite because it's quite a bitter tasting salad crop, but it's certainly one that I like to grow, and it's certainly very winter hardy. Now, we could sow the seeds outside but under protection, I would say, depending of course where you are in the country, but indoors no problems. We could grow kale as a mini microgreen or a salad crop, not so much for full-size kale. Again, these will need to be indoors in some sort of heat. Then we got a couple of the perennial plants that I also grow every winter now. We've got asparagus, which there's so many different varieties, and again, it's quite easy to grow from seed. I thoroughly enjoy asparagus, and I'm building some new asparagus beds. The good thing about asparagus is that it can last for up to 20 years, so good preparation. You imagine having a plant that you've grown from seed for 20 years. Asparagus is definitely one of my favourite. And the other perennial plant as well is artichoke, globe artichoke. Now, I've got to admit, I'm not a huge fan of globe artichokes. We've got one on the allotment that I inherited. I find it a bit of a faff to eat the artichokes, but we're trying with some different varieties. There's some purple varieties out there. I think the plants themselves look very architectural. They look very pretty, so they might be suitable if you are looking for some architectural plants that are also edible. I'm not a fan, as I say, but I think that's how we cook and eat them. We need to find ways of making the artichokes rather suitable. Then we've got three of what I would call as the summer sun-loving crops. Chilies, sweet peppers, and aubergines. Now, I put these in because I find that these three plants need a very long growing period. It does make a huge difference, don't get me wrong, a long growing period, and you're more than likely to get decent crops out of these three plants. But they will need to be indoors to start the seeds off, especially if you've got heated propagators or grow lights. You're going to be off to a much bigger chance. But the real advantage, as I say, they need a long growing season. So come March, they'll be in a greenhouse. And then from about mid-May, they will need to be up against a self-facing wall in order to get some really good productive plants out of them. It can certainly be done. I highly recommend you give it a try and see how you get on. I'd love to find out more what seeds you're sowing in January as well. Let me know in the comments. Right, it's time to find out what Chef Scott has for us this week.
Chopping all the veggies, sizzle in the air. Chef Scott with the magic, smells are everywhere. Water starts to boil, onions hit the pan. Recipe of the week, let the feast begin. Cooking with Chef Scott, flavors come alive. Tune in every week for a tasty bite.
Hi, it's Scott here with this week's recipe, and sticking with the theme of sunshine on a plate during January, but also wanting comfort food at the same time, I created this recipe: mac and cheese loaded with Cajun corn and tomatoes. I think the combination of the creamy mac and cheese and sweet corn, with the kick of the heat from the Cajun spice, gives you a comfort food feel, but with fresh summer vibes. And if you have sweet corn in the freezer from last year's harvest, then this would be a great recipe for that. But you could also experiment with other vegetables you might have in the freezer. Something like peas or beans would work well. It's just a case of adapting to what you have and swapping the sweet corn out for it. So let's head to the kitchen and hear how it's made. As usual, you can find this recipe and others on the veggrowpodcast.co.uk and on my Instagram page, Seed to Table Plot 13. This recipe serves 4 people, and you will need, for the mac and cheese, 250 grams of macaroni, 40 grams of butter, 40 grams of plain flour, 600 millilitres of milk, 250 grams of grated cheddar, 50 grams of grated Comté cheese, or you could use Parmesan, and for the sweet corn topping, 260 grams of sweet corn kernels, 1 red pepper diced or 70 grams, 100 grams of cherry tomatoes cut in half, 80 grams of diced red onion, and 1 tablespoon of Cajun spice. Method: start by cooking the pasta in salted boiling water for 9 minutes, then drain and set aside. Now make the cheese sauce by melting the butter in a saucepan and adding the flour, whisking together to form a roux, and then cook the roux for a couple of minutes whilst whisking. Now gradually whisk in the milk a little at a time and cook for 10 minutes until thickened and smooth. Then add the grated cheeses and mix with the pasta, and add this mix to an oven-proof dish and set aside. Now make the topping by stir-frying all the sweet corn toppings together with a little oil until slightly softened but not breaking down. Now add this mix on top of the mac and cheese and bake in a preheated oven set at 200 degrees Celsius for 15 to 20 minutes. And that's the recipe done. And that's it from me this week.
Now, as you probably established, that the theme of today's podcast is all about seed sowing. And I'm a big believer in growing as many plants as we can from seed. But I will have to say I am quite lucky because I've used technology to help me out with this. Technology in the form of heated propagators, which just provide a little bit of bottom heat to the soil and to the seeds to get them started a little bit quicker, a little bit earlier. Heated propagators are pretty cheap, to be honest with you, and they don't use much electricity. If you get one with a thermostat, they use even less electricity as well. But I know not everybody has those. They are a bit of a luxury, but if you can afford one, I highly recommend you get some heated propagators. Another thing that I have that really helps with seed sowing is grow lights. Now, one of the things that we find in January is that we get very short days, although the days are getting longer. And especially at the beginning of January, there's very little light. We only get a few hours, really. Sunrise is about 8 o'clock in the morning at the moment, and it sets at 4. So it's only about 8 hours of light. Any young seeds are going to struggle to find enough light, unless, of course, it is the right type of seed. Grow lights, I find, just add that extra bit of light to help them out. Give them that good start. I have my grow lights on for about 18 hours a day. That provides them off to a really, really strong start and gets them growing well. There's a bit of an art form to grow lights, but again, if you can afford grow lights, they are well worth the investment, in my opinion. But talking of technology and seed sowing, there's a few things that we're also experimenting a bit more with this year. Hydroponics. Last May, I bought a hydroponics system from Gardener's World Spring Fair, and I've been growing basil in that in my kitchen throughout last year, and it did very, very well, I've got to say. What I'm doing this year, and I've had a discussion on our live show about this, is I'm trying to grow some more different vegetables and experiment a bit more with what we can actually grow in this hydroponics kit. My hydroponics kit is from West Kent Hydroponics, and it's the mini 5-pod system. So it's the smallest system that they do. It has enough pods for 5 different plants. And I'm going to be growing things like tomatoes, chilies, peppers in there to see just how well they grow. Now, I've already said it's wrong time to sow tomatoes, but in hydroponics, the great thing about hydroponics, especially indoor hydroponics, is they're less reliant on the outdoor temperature. They rely more on your indoor temperature. So indoors, they should be okay for tomatoes. And because they have a grow lights usually attached to these, they also get enough light. Now, if you don't know what hydroponics is basically soilless gardening. Basically, you have little pods, could be foam, could be rock wool, in which the plants grow, but these sit in a nutrient-rich water which gets pumped around to keep the water fresh. Now, the emphasis here is on nutrient-rich water because you do have to add nutrients to the water in order to get them growing. One of the drawbacks, however, is that hydroponic gardening cannot be organic. Now, there's not really organic feeds for these bit of kits. They've been tried, but they found to be too smelly. The real problem with hydroponic gardening, however, is that hydroponics cannot be organic in the UK because it requires the soil association and it's about looking after the soil. So hydroponics don't fall into that anyway. But as an experiment, we're looking forward to seeing how we get on with the hydroponics. Now, one of the other emerging technologies, of course, AI. And artificial intelligence is becoming the very in thing. I have to admit, and I spoke about this before, I'm not a huge fan of AI. I can see the potential in it, and I think we do need to keep up with AI. Now, last year, I mentioned that I asked AI to create a seed sowing calendar for me for 2025. Basically, give me a list of seeds that I can sow every week. And what I'm doing as a bit of an experiment is I'm following along and sowing these seeds that they recommend that we sow. So for week 1, which is the 1st to the 7th of January, it's recommended that we sow parsley, chervil, winter lettuce, landcress, spring onions, rhubarb, alpine strawberries, tomatoes, sweet peas, winter rye and crimson clover. Now, it has said most of these are to be sown indoors, particularly the tomatoes, which they've actually listed the garden pole variety, which is a dwarfing variety that we could sow indoors under grow lights, etc., in order to get tomatoes earlier. It's an interesting development to see how this works. I have to admit, I'm not going to exclusively just sow all the seeds that it says. There's still going to be more seeds that I probably would sow. But I am going to experiment with this AI and just see how well this seed sowing calendar works out for me and how it keeps me on track, or does it do quite well at choosing the right seeds throughout the year that we can sow. Now, next week, it recommends sowing coriander, rocket, spinach, microgreens, radish and mustard, chilies and tagettes or marigolds. So there's quite a wide variety. I did ask for companion plants, which is why the marigolds is in there, and I tried to cover every type of vegetable that we could possibly ever eat when I've asked AI to come up with this seed plan. It's going to be an interesting experiment, I've got to say, but the first week was pretty busy with sowing of all these seeds. It does look like it's going to get easier as we go on in, but I think it's going to be a good experiment. I will keep you posted. And we will see just what happens in the future. Well, we're coming to the end of this week's podcast. I said it's all about seed sowing at the moment, but we're going to get more and more seed sowing throughout the year. And it's going to be a subject that I think we're going to talk about a lot this year. But if you have enjoyed this podcast, then please do leave a rate and review on your podcast provider. It only takes you a few seconds, but it means the world to us. Now, most weeks Lynn does leave us a review, and she has said over on Spotify that 2024 has been her first whole year on her new plot. She just wanted to thank me for this podcast. It's given her so much support and information. I look back at my gardening with such joy and happiness. I'm really looking forward to listening in 2025. Happy New Year to you, and Happy New Year to you as well, Lynn. I've got to say, one of the things that I recommend that everybody does as we're starting a new year, take a photo of your allotment, take a photo of your kitchen garden, just so you've got an idea to see what you are starting off with. Gives you a good base plate and something to refer back to as we go on throughout the year. In fact, what I would say is every month take a photo of your garden, your allotment, and just see how it changes throughout the year. So please do rate and review on your podcast provider. Also, don't forget to please consider becoming a member of our supporters club. Just £5 a month to be a member. We help keep this podcast running. Most importantly, it keeps this podcast running. If you want to get in touch, you can email me, richard@theveggrowpodcast.co.uk. You can also leave a comment on the bottom of a blog post at theveggrowpodcast.co.uk, or you can leave us a voicemail also at theveggrowpodcast.co.uk. Also, don't forget you can find me on social media where you can also contact me or just follow and like. We're posting more on social media at the moment, and we're getting some great response. So please do come along and join in. Well, that is it for this week. We will be back again next week, and I suspect that the weather is going to get better over this next week, so we can actually get outside and do some more gardening. Until next time, please take care.